are the Yu-Gi-Oh decks that can compete in the Tier 0 meta. Today, big dog, I've comprised a tier list of some of the most popular and powerful Yu-Gi-Oh decks, and we'll be ranking them on how well they can go against the newest threat in Snake Eyes and Fire King. Because that's all we got now is Tier 0 format. And of course, as usual, if you guys think that there's a particular deck that we should be talking about, go ahead and let me know down below in the comment section. You could genuinely be helping somebody beat the top Yu-Gi-Oh deck, because ain't nobody got time to be spending thousands of dollars on Yu-Gi-Oh just to be able to play. Let's go ahead and jump on in. What's going on with ya, big dog? It is an amazing day for Yu-Gi-Oh! I hope that your day, phenomenal. But if it isn't, don't let what happened at the beginning of your day ruin the rest of your day. So the criteria for this particular tier list is going to be slightly different, since we are in a Tier 0 format, which means the most popular and overly dominant deck is Snake Eyes and Snake Eyes Fire King. We will be comparing these strategies to how they play against that particular deck. It's really the only criteria. But to add a little bit more to it, of course, I still will be ranking these decks on how powerful they are, and as well as peeping some particular situations for these decks when it comes to matchups with other strategies. Keep in mind, since Snake Eyes is the most powerful deck, the cards to be able to beat Snake Eyes will be played in some other strategies which could affect your deck's ranking. You can almost say that this is an updated best decks tier list post YCS Las Vegas. But let's go ahead and start off with Scareclaw. Scareclaw doesn't necessarily have any properties that makes it really good against Snake Eyes Fire King, and it also is a deck that will struggle to find cards that are really good against the deck, like running Dimensional Shifter. Now, I do have a Scareclaw deck on the channel that you should check out if you're really interested in playing the deck. I think it's the best way to play it, but for right now, I think that Scareclaw is a strategy that will struggle. Unfortunately, right now, I would say there's not really much that's going for this deck that would put it in an advantageous spot to win games. Now, it's almost cheap to say that Rescue Ace deserves to be on this tier list. Why? Because this deck can play and should play Snake Eyes cards. I will say, though, it is a little bit cheaper than some of the other Snake Eyes decks, as you don't necessarily need Wanted. There have been successful decks just running Diabellstar for the Rescue Ace deck. Now, overall, I think one of the biggest problems with Rescue Ace is consistency. It is reliant on the Snake Eyes engine, something that people are looking to stop. And then there's a lot more effect negation to be able to stop Rescue Ace Turbulence. If you keep those in mind, I still think that this deck is a deck that is in between solid choice and can challenge, but I'm going to say it still can challenge. Rescue Ace ironically does have an incredible grind game, and being able to set 4 cards face down to be able to stay into the game and disrupt your opponent is crazy. It also possesses one of the few cards that can stop all of a monster's effects through Extinguish, and also the deck is good against popular cards like Dimension Shifter. I think that gives this deck an edge over a lot of strategies in the game. Now, dragons do find themselves in another precarious situation. This strategy does not necessarily get better in this format. In actuality, in the top cut, there were a ton of players playing the Bestial monsters, which can be catastrophic for you. On the flip side, for dragons, this deck is almost immune to hand traps and can summon powerful monsters like Berlin Dragon, which is incredibly hard for decks like Fire King or Snake Eyes to be able to beat. I'm going to put dragons in good enough to steal W's. This deck can be incredibly hard to stop, but I think the previous hits on the Forbidden list has slowed it down enough to make it non-desirable to play. If a card like Chaos Space is off the list, I think it makes it a lot more consistent, which also makes it a bigger threat towards some of the top decks. But for right now, you're going to need a really good player. Now, Yubel is an interesting choice because this deck benefits off of its cards being destroyed. It also has a unique way of dealing with Fire King decks, forcing you to attack into Yubel and then inflicting mad damage with cards like Nightmare Pain and of course your Yubel monsters. The deck also does not care about being banished, so it can play cards like Dimension Shifter, and it can fuse off your opponent's entire board. Crazy. I think Yubel is going to be in the solid choice category. I think a couple of flaws for Yubel is consistency issues, but that does get a lot better in Legacy of Destruction. Overall, this is a really good deck, and people are buying Yubels in mass in preparation for it. Now, Vanquish Soul is one of my favorite decks of all time. Probably one of the only decks that I played for a month and a half straight. I'm telling you, my boy, I like Vanquish Soul so much. I got it in max rarity. This was a lot of money. I spent $800 on Vanquish Soul just to tell you that this deck will struggle into the format. Let's be real, guys. This deck can be a Dimension Shifter deck, but it's one of the worst Dimension Shifter decks available. It's also reliant on its summon, which if that does get thwarted, you are in a really bad spot, and is a deck that can just be simply outpaced. Big dog, as much as I do love Vanquish Soul, I don't think right now is the opportunity for this deck to be able to thrive. Moving on for Magispectors, there was a point in time where I had complete copium for this deck. I thought it was going to be one of the top decks from Phantom Nightmare. Yeah. The first strategy in Find a New Hobby is going to be in there for a good reason. The Magispector monsters specifically say when they are summoned, you can perform a specific action. The problem with this is that when you combine it with the new Magispector spell card, Magispector Win, in response to an opponent's card effect, you will not be able to gain the effect of your Magispector monsters. That's huge. Also, another worst part about this deck is that its strategy can easily be thwarted by placing the wrong monsters into the Pendulum Zone with Flame Beurge. I don't know, guys, maybe if this was 2021 when the Magispector support came out, it would have been good, but for right now, it's not that good. Now, Phantom Knights did see a resurgence with the new Horus cards. This is a deck that's built on being able to summon some really powerful combo monsters. The problem with that is that none of them really do a lot against Fire King or Snake Eyes. I think that it's really harsh to put another strategy in Find a New Hobby, but there's not really much that this deck does against the Fire King Snake Eyes strategy. That combined with cards like Dimension Shifter being played a lot and Bystials being in every side deck, this deck will struggle. Overall, by no means, these are not bad Yu-Gi-Oh decks. They're just not going to have a great time right now. Moving on to Tearlaments. Some people hate them, some people love them. I think that Tearlaments is definitely good enough to steal W's. Tearlaments is good for a couple of reasons. The first one is that it's almost incredibly hard to destroy. Destroying Tearlaments monsters will only trigger their effects, and the deck is really good at being able to manage the graveyard through the Ishizu Shufflers. I never thought that we'd be looking at Tearlaments as the savior for the Snake Eyes format, but shuffling cards back into the deck is one of the best ways to beat them. The problem is this deck is now inconsistent. Tearlaments has found itself in a spot where deck building and player skill is needed to be able to pilot this deck, and keep in mind cards like Dimension Shifter and Bystials are still present in the format, which doesn't bode well for the deck. Now, when the new format came out, players said that Labrynth was going to be the best deck. It ain't been it, Chief. And while Labrynth hasn't necessarily struggled, it hasn't really done anything to be considered as one of the top decks, let alone a deck that can be really good against Snake Eyes. There's been zero representation inside of the top cut. I think Labrynth is a deck that's good enough to steal W's. There are some players really cooking with this strategy, being able to summon the Dark Barrier statue to their field and protect. Labrynth isn't bad by any means, but as long as players are running Ash Blossom and Ghost Spell to be able to stop Fire Kings, Labrynth unfortunately will struggle because of those cards. Purrely, this deck, I gotta say, I was wrong about. Not only does Purrely have the ability to dodge most hand traps in the game, it also can summon an unaffected monster to the side of the field. I think if you can make huge unaffected monsters, you're in a good spot for Yu-Gi-Oh right now. Something that these four decks have in common is that they make really sticky monsters incredibly hard to get or can punish your opponent for getting rid of them. It seems to be the way to be able to handle Fire King in this format, and also being able to deal with their hand interruptions, which Purrely does pretty well. Now, unfortunately, I think Orcus is in the exact same slot as Phantom Knights. The deck is nowhere near bad, but unfortunately just does not do enough to be able to compete, and there are other decks that could be a little bit more successful. And now we got to talk about Shaddolls. Holy! Shaddolls as a pure deck should not be on this tier list. But let us cook. Shaddoll as an engine, or possibly even Shaddoll Invoked Dogmatica, could have a lot of potential there. The reason why I say that is because Shaddoll Winda is the antithesis of the tier 0 format right now. It completely stops the opponent. Also, cards like Invoked Mechaba allow you to be able to banish the threat, which is huge. I think that the deck does have a lot of mystery and allure to it, and I've even thought about building a deck profile involving this Yu-Gi-Oh strategy. If you want to see it, let me know. But until we get more hands and more testing on the strategy, I'm going to put it in will struggle. One of the deck's biggest problems is getting to Alistair the Invoker as fast as possible, and I'm looking into ways to be able to solve that, and also being able to dodge important hand traps like Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence. Outside of that, this deck does have a chance to be pretty good. Now, unfortunately, the hits to Rika made the deck a lot less desirable, but it's still a strategy that if it can use Rika Kon, it can tribute off your opponent's monsters to activate their effects. I'm going to go ahead and put Rika in the good enough to steal W's. This is a deck that still has cards like Cactus Bouncer and a ton of negates. It can completely shut down the entire strategy within the right hands. Salamangreat right now is probably the only fire Yu-Gi-Oh deck that does not play the Snake Eyes engine. It's the savior we need the most. Unfortunately for Salamangreat, that's not a benefit, that's a knock, and it's an entire fire Yu-Gi-Oh deck. That means that cards like Hida are always live against the deck and helps the other deck combo. This might be my hopium talking, but just as much as players can use Hida against Salamangreat, Salamangreat can use Hida too. I think overall this deck is probably good enough to steal W's. It's still a fire deck, so Promethean Princess just might be the godsend for the deck, helping you link into monsters like Salamangreat Pyro Phoenix. It does have the opportunity to be incredibly sticky, as well as play a ton of hand traps to slow your opponent down. I think good enough to steal W's is probably my copium talking, but let me know what you think about that one. Brandit may not have seen any tops in YCS Las Vegas, but it still is a really solid Yu-Gi-Oh deck and one of the few decks that can challenge. Now with Gimmick Puppet Nightmare getting its reprint, and hopefully soon Guiding Quim, this is a deck that more people will have access to, meaning that we should see more and being able to take advantage of its abilities to be able to stop Fire King and Snake Eyes. Brandit is also one of the biggest reasons Snake Eye players do side the Bestial monsters because they don't want to be Gimmick Puppet locked. I think Marincess does have one thing going great for it. It makes an unaffected monster. The bad part is that its unaffected monster is dependent on a field spell that can be affected by destruction. For cards like SP, Lotorite, and Cosmic Cyclone, I'm going to go ahead and put Marincess in the will struggle. It's almost crazy how this water deck that can use World Sea Dragon Zealantis isn't good as a fire deck that uses World Sea Dragon Zealantis. Swordsoul. My brother, what are we doing here? Swordsoul is a strategy that you guys requested to be on this tier list, and Swordsoul can lose to a lot of things right now. Between Imperms, Effect Veilers, Ghost Mourners, Nibs, yeah, this ain't the format, my boy. I will say that a skilled Swordsoul player can take advantage of a lot of great things into the format. I would say anytime cards like Nibiru the Primal Being are being played into a format, it's not as great for Swordsoul. Though this could be a good deck, it will struggle against strategies that are using that, which should be just about everybody. Now, Voiceless Voice was the second most represented deck in the entire event. And the reason why is because it actually does have a solid matchup against Snake Eye. It can use El Shaddoll Winda to be able to slow the deck down, but more importantly, since it doesn't need its extra deck space, cards like Super Polymerization are easy to get access to. Voiceless Voice just might be the strongest deck on this entire tier list. Now for heroes, maybe I'm coping, but cards like Match Change help you dodge effect negations, and the deck has a walking dimensional shifter inside of Master Hero Darklaw, which punishes your opponent from searching. I think since heroes have solved their Nibiru problem through solid deck building, this is a solid choice Yu-Gi-Oh deck. You might catch me playing heroes to be able to destroy the meta because it is a deck that is built in this particular meta. Now moving on to Mannadium, I actually just so happen to have a ton of experience with this deck. It is really good against a lot of hand traps, can play well against Dimension Shifter. I think that Mannadium is another one of those solid choice, probably even a can challenge type Yu-Gi-Oh deck. It's really, really good right now. One of the biggest ops for Mannadium is Droll and Lockbird, and that card is iffy. If we start to see players playing Droll a lot less, then this deck becomes a lot better. Dinos. You may think that I'm coping here too, but I think Dinos is another solid choice Yu-Gi-Oh deck. We are in a combo format, and anytime we're in a combo format, summoning Ultimate Conductor Tyranno is never a bad idea, especially when you can protect it with cards like Miscellaneous Eris. This deck can be a solid contender. Now, it's ironic that both Tearlaments and Kashtira have natural counters to Fire King. Kashtira Unicorn being able to banish important cards like Link Kribo and Promethean Princess, Fenrir being able to get rid of threats face down, but more importantly, Kashtira Birth is literally a soul release during both players' turns. except they get banished face down. I think Kashtira is also one of the best decks to be able to play inside of this format. With enough board breakers or hand traps, this can slow the opponent down, then your cash monsters do most of the heavy lifting. Horus as a pure deck. I ain't gonna lie, I think that Horus has some things going for it. King Sarcophagus ironically prevents your Horus monsters from being destroyed. That's huge. The deck also summons more powerful monsters than Appaloosa. Now, the problem with Horus is that it doesn't do enough right now. You either have to commit to summoning your Horus monsters or you get your one Exceed monster, which I would put pure Horus in will struggle because it doesn't have all of the tools to be incredibly competitive. Now, Unchained losing Shavara, I still think to this day is unfair. Unchained with 3 Shavara actually is a deck that can compete with Wave King Caesar. Fortunately enough, there is a card named Berserk Archfiend that does help the deck make rank 6s, which means that Wave Caesar is still pretty good against Fire King. I think that Unchained is still good enough to steal Ws. There are a ton of hand traps that are being played right now that Unchained can play around, and overall, it's just a solid deck with the right pilot. Centurion is interesting right now. Centurion may be the best way to play Horus right now because not only do you get the benefit of summoning monsters that are almost immune to your opponent's cards, you also have a way to completely lock out your opponent with Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Calamity. I think Centurions are a solid choice, just a really good Yu-Gi-Oh deck that can compete. Raidraptors are easily one of my favorite decks in the format. Not too long ago, I gave you guys an amazing duel with Raidraptors, and I'll even be putting an updated build on my Patreon as a special thank you for helping me pay my editors. This is a crazy good card. Rising Rebellion Falcon can be a 5,300 attack monster when you have Brave Strix under it that is unaffected by card effects. And it's also incredibly easy to summon. It also can destroy all your opponent's cards. I think Raidraptors are one of the best decks to be able to challenge Fire King. We already said that the deck struggles against cards like Purrely Noir, the Yubel cards, Rue Kalos, and the Whirlwind Dragon. This deck can summon those unaffected monsters easier than all of the other strategies mentioned. And if you do play the deck correctly, it even has some sick combos from preventing your opponent from using important monster effects. Now, Floowandereeze is one of the only decks that topped inside of YCS Las Vegas. It's easily a deck that can challenge. The biggest reason why I would say that is because not only does Dimensional Shifter shut out so many decks in the game, but Harpy's Featherstorm is almost like Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Calamity, except a little bit easier to summon and less susceptible to card effects. And lastly is Chimera. Where do I put this card? Where do I put Chimera as a strategy? Chimera has not received a single top this format. And I think the difference is because a branded version of the deck or a more pure branded deck actually has solid counters against Fire King. With that being said, this deck is left to the wayside. I would put it in Find a New Hobby, but the only reason why is because branded, the deck that is tied with it, is slightly better. Again, I don't think that the bottom row is bad in any way, shape, or form. There are actually some tough strategies that you could build and could have success with. It's just you are genuinely going against the grain, and if you were that successful, you could be way more successful with any of these other decks. And that's all that I have for today's tier list. I want you guys to let me know what are some strategies that I forgot, or maybe if there's something that I got right or wrong and why. Of course, big dog, if you want to see more amazing videos, be sure to check out these other ones so I can catch you on the next one.